It's hard to believe how much work goes into a single project. Some can take years or even decades to create. Usually most musicians are so tired by this point, they just want to move on and get the album moving. As the old saying goes, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I say, how can you not? The cover of an album is just like a thumbnail. It's the first thing that a buyer or watcher would look at even before considering picking up the album or clicking on the video. I'm going to show you two album covers, and to be honest, which one would you pick up first? And both are from the same band. And don't judge it by the tracks that are on the album. Instead, focus on the album cover itself. On the right, we have Back in Black, and on the left, we have Highway to Hell. Personally, I would pick up Highway to Hell for the intense character that the album gives off. Now, which one would you say sold more? If you said AC/DC's Back in Black, then you would be correct, this being in the top 5 highest sold albums of all time. The album of Back in Black is almost reminiscent of Vsauce or those rap videos that you see on YouTube recommendations and leaves you wondering, I wonder what this is about, leaving a sense of mystery to the album or to the video. Generally speaking, most albums usually lay between 3 different categories. The artists or the artists, a picture of the artist themselves, like for example, Aladdin Sane by David Bowie, or Van Halen's Van Halen No. 1, or any album by Adele. Image category, taking an original picture of a location or object and adding something to the original photo, such as Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, or Tame Impala Loserism, or Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother. And finally, my personal favorite album category, original artwork / abstract. Albums such as Velvet Underground's The Velvet Underground and Nico, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Tame Impala's Currents, or King Crimson's Court of the Crimson King. Sometimes albums can have all sorts of variations of all 3 of these genres, such as The Who's Who's Next, Boston's Third Stage, or Pink Floyd's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, or A Momentary Lapse of Reason. This is something that I could talk about for hours on end. A single picture can define something so much more behind the cover of a piece of media. And really, no matter how hard I try to understand it, I can't seem to figure out how something so complex can divide a good album cover and a bad album cover, from a bad thumbnail to a good thumbnail. But I can get pretty close to what draws human attention, and you would consider it to be a good piece of art. First off, let's look at the don'ts before we look at the do's. Don't do anything like Adele. Period.
Just a simple, bland, tasteless picture of yourself with a bland, tasteless color, no editing, no original art, no fancy bold text, just a dull, completely expressionless picture of yourself.
Sure, her albums may sell great, but her album cover are as unique as a stale piece of bread, with nothing original other than her own face, which to me is about as lazy as you can get for an album cover. The only way you can get away with something like this is if you're an extremely popular celebrity already who can afford to use yourself in your own brand recognition. But even still, some of the greatest musicians and talented YouTubers never use their own face in the album or thumbnail. I'm generally one of those people. One, I can't really afford to, and I really don't want to be honest. Even taking just something as simple text, if used creatively, and high contrast colors can work better than just some random unclear picture of your own face. I can think of no better example than the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols album cover. A bright neon yellow background and a large bold text at the top, followed by a newsprint cutout letters slapped crudely pastely together at the bottom, spelling out the band's name. To me, this really represents the Sex Pistols perfectly. The bright yellow representing their pompous, arrogant, flashy attitude, and the bottom cutout newsprint texting represent their crude humor and low quality recording. And you see, I got so much more out of an album with just a few simple texts and colors than any of Adele's album covers. Another huge problem with album colors, and just like thumbnails, sometimes they're hard to see, or too cluttered, or just downright fuzzy. A good example of this being the problem with albums like Weezer's OK Human, Imagine Dragons' Mercury's Axe on 1 and 2, and the worst of all, Maroon 5's Red Pill Blues. I loathe this album so unbelievably much. Using freaking Snapchat filters on an album? Come on, bro. When you have an album cover like Songs About Jane, an album cover that is so creative and expressive, and you release this fat turd? Well, maybe it was more of a behind the scenes big business decision. It's like, you got a big producer and he's all like, We need to appeal to the Gen Z kids, so I want you to put pictures of yourself with Snapchat filters to express yourself. Well, maybe if Adele had done the exact same thing, it would have given her albums a little bit more personality. Another thing about these albums is that they're so cluttered and it's so hard to make out anything, especially the newest Imagine Dragons album. Seriously, I have to pull out a magnifying glass to find the album centerpiece. I've also had similar problems in the past when making my thumbnails, as sometimes they come out cluttered with very horrid colors that I think look good at the time, but heavily take away from whatever I'm trying to convey in the video. Which brings me to my next point and just how important colors are to the album. Some of my favorite albums have some of the most unique and vibrant colors of all time, such as Maroon 5's Songs About Janes, Jimi Hendrix's Axis Bold as Love, Pink Floyd's Echoes, John Prine's childlike cartoon drawing in Lost Dogs Mixed Blessings, or the crude oil-like painting of Frank Sinatra's September of My Years. The importance of color of working on a thumbnail is so important because the human eyes are so drawn to bright, cheerful colors that immediately draw on our excitement. Also, if you want to make a video about something serious, to grab one's attention, companies use high reds and blues to draw easy attraction because they're so rare and hard to find out in nature. Or sometimes someone can use the absence of color with dirty, dark grays and blacks to invoke emotions of sadness or completely mixed emotions of the hardships of life or a presence of calm, such as Elliott Smith's Figure 8, Jimi Hendrix, The Cry of Love, the Ramones' Rocket to Russia, the dirty, grainy colors of T-Rex, Electric Warriors, or Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral, or using small amounts of color to contrast a deep faded color such as Tool's album cover, Undertow. Many thumbnails also use a sense of colors to show off usually some sort of strange, bizarre, or something controversial. I myself have tried this work with dark colors as well. Finally, the most important element of an album or thumbnail is the centerpiece, or the pose. This literally takes up usually 80% of the album or thumbnail. And some of the most iconic albums have some of the best centerpieces or sometimes the best poses, such as Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Green Day's American Idiot, Nirvana's Nevermind, Def Leppard's Pyromania, or Led Zeppelin's One, or albums with very iconic poses such as The Who's Who's Next, Sammy Hagar's Three Lock Box, Prince's Purple Rain, or Michael Jackson's Thriller. The centerpiece of an album literally sometimes defines an entire generation and gives influence for many other musicians to use similar ideas, just like how on YouTube, how one thumbnail idea can change the landscape of an entire meta of YouTube itself, and sometimes can take long periods of time to create and take entire crews of teams to make, such as the case with Pink Floyd's album A Momentary Lapse of Reason, making a staple of album cover history and inspiring many other great works of art. It's just hard to believe that something so small can have such big impacts.